December 21st, 1939, Kollaa, Finland. The forest was so cold it seemed alive, every branch snapping like brittle bones beneath the weight of ice. Dawn never truly arrived this far north in winter, only a diluted grey smudge that hovered beneath the horizon, unable to push back the darkness. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, catching the faint light like tiny shards of frozen glass. The quiet was absolute, a quiet so total that men felt they were intruders in a place that belonged to something older than war. Through that silence moved a Soviet column, hundreds of men pushing cautiously through frost-crusted trees, breath freezing on their scarves, fingers stiff around their rifles. They expected an ambush. They expected mines, machine gun nests, artillery fire, but they did not expect what waited ahead. On a wind-scraped ridge, beneath a sagging curtain of snow-covered pines, a single man lay motionless. He had been lying there for hours, unmoving, unblinking. A white smock draped over him so perfectly that even the forest seemed unsure he was real. No breath fogged from his mouth. No glint came from his rifle. His outline dissolved into the drift around him, until he looked not like a soldier, but a shape the snow itself had formed. His fingers rested lightly on the wooden stock of a Finnish M28-30 rifle. Iron sights only, its barrel buried in a small mound of packed snow to eliminate any muzzle flash. The man waiting in that silence was Simo Häyhä. Before the sun dipped again, more than 24 Soviet soldiers would attempt to cross the clearing below him. None would reach the other side. The first shot cracked through the cold like a tree branch splitting under ice. A Soviet lieutenant collapsed before the echo reached the tree line. A second soldier fell so quickly that the others thought they were hearing only one shot. The formation broke instantly as panic rippled down the column. Men dropped to their knees, firing blindly into the forest, into shadows, into the wind, anywhere that felt safer than where they stood. But the White Death, as the Soviets would soon call him, had already chambered another round. 5 seconds. Another man dropped, then another, and another. Within minutes, the clearing transformed from a snowy meadow into a field of bodies scattered like dark stains across the white. The survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist. They crawled behind saplings too thin to shield them, behind boulders too far from where the shots were coming, behind each other. Anything to break the invisible line that kept cutting into them with calm, surgical precision. They didn't know it yet, but they were not fighting a typical sniper. They were fighting a man shaped by a lifetime in a land where cold, silence, and patience weren't obstacles. They were home. To understand how a quiet farmer became the most lethal sniper in recorded history, you have to understand the place that made him. Simo Häyhä was born in 1905 in Rautjärvi, a small village carved out of dense forests and surrounded by lakes that froze solid for half the year. Winters were long, brutal, relentless. Children in that part of Finland didn't grow up learning to tolerate the cold. They grew up learning to become part of it. Simo was short, lean, and unassuming. He barely cleared 5 feet in height, and his quiet nature made him easy to overlook. But what others mistook for shyness was something different. Absolute focus. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he acted. And the forest rewarded that kind of boy. He spent much of his youth hunting, not for sport, but for survival. When he aimed at a bird or a rabbit, missing meant going home empty-handed. He learned quickly that every shot mattered. He learned that sound travelled strangely in frozen air. He learned how to move without disturbing snow, how to track animals by reading patterns most people would never notice. In the summers, he worked the farm, repairing fences and tools, helping harvest barley and tend livestock. In the winters, he became a ghost moving through the trees, a boy whose footprints often appeared alone beside those of a deer he was quietly pursuing. These were not hobbies. These were skills that would one day make him a legend. Skills he never knew were training him for war. As he grew older, he joined the Civil Guard, a voluntary militia where men trained on weekends to defend their country. Here, instructors immediately noticed something unusual. Simo wasn't flashy, he wasn't fast, he wasn't loud, but he hit everything he aimed at, every single time. He fired between heartbeats, steadied his breath with perfect timing, and squeezed the trigger so gently that the rifle didn't seem to move at all. He could fire 5 shots in a row and leave a group so tight it looked like one bullet hole. His peers joked that he didn't shoot bullets. He placed them. But Simo didn't laugh. He didn't boast. He didn't explain. He simply did what he always did. Practiced. And when he won shooting competitions across Finland in the 1930s, he accepted the ammunition prizes with a nod and went straight home. No photos, no speeches, no celebration. It wasn't modesty, it was simply who he was. He was a man who believed the world rewarded discipline, not noise. By the late 1930s, the world around him began to crack. Tensions with the Soviet Union escalated. Stalin's government demanded Finnish territory near Leningrad. Negotiations failed. Border incidents increased. Finnish newspapers reported ominous troop movements. The Finnish government quietly prepared for the worst. Simo didn't talk about politics, but he saw the unease growing around him. He saw officers from the civil guard whispering in low voices. He saw men checking their rifles more frequently. He saw the frost on the trees thickening earlier in the year, as if nature itself sensed the coming storm. Then, on November 30th, 1939, that storm hit. The Soviet Union invaded Finland with nearly 500,000 men, an overwhelming tidal wave of tanks, artillery, planes and infantry pouring across the border. Their commanders predicted a 2-week war. They believed they would overrun the Finns with ease. Instead, they found themselves entering a frozen nightmare. And one of the first Finns to report for duty was a 5-foot-tall, soft-spoken farmer with a rifle he knew better than his own heartbeat. Simo was assigned to the 34th Infantry Regiment, sent to defend a stretch of wilderness around the Kollaa River. It wasn't a city. It wasn't a fortress. It was just forest. Endless forest. And the men who fought there had to become part of it. The Soviets outnumbered the Finns by staggering margins, sometimes 80-1, sometimes 100-1. Their tanks froze in place, their rifles jammed. Their officers shouted orders that the wind swallowed whole. And lurking somewhere in that white wasteland was a man who had grown up in terrain just like this. A man who understood cold, not as a hardship, but as a familiar companion. On his first day, officers offered him a scoped rifle. He declined. Scopes fogged in the cold. Scopes reflected sunlight. Scopes required the shooter to raise his head, an unnecessary risk. Iron sights were simple, reliable, invisible. He modified his firing position instinctively, packing snow around the barrel to muffle muzzle blast, keeping snow in his mouth so his breath wouldn't betray him, lying flat in places no sniper was supposed to lie, open snowfields with no cover except the cold itself. Soviet scouts soon discovered what that meant. His first confirmed kill was a test of patience. A Soviet soldier creeping through birch trees, careful, alert, experienced. Simo waited motionless. The moment the man lifted his head a little too high, Simo's shot slid under the helmet rim and ended him instantly. Finnish soldiers found the body later and realized someone special had joined the fight. Soviet soldiers learned the same thing even faster. Rumors spread among their ranks. There was a sniper the Finns called invisible, a phantom in the trees, a man who shot without being seen, without being heard, without making mistakes. They began calling him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. As December deepened, the Soviets launched wave after wave of assaults on the Finnish lines. They pushed forward through forests so thick that trees blocked their formations. They stumbled through knee-deep snow. They tried to overwhelm the Finns with sheer numbers, but every advance ended the same way. With one calm, measured rifle shot. Officers fell first, machine gunners next, then the formation collapsed. Soviet soldiers fired blindly. They hid behind trees too thin to stop bullets. They huddled together like animals fleeing a predator they could not see. The Finns quickly learned to build entire defensive strategies around Simo. He shot first. The Soviets panicked. The Finns counterattacked. The system worked so well that the men began saying 3 words that would become famous. Kollaa kestää. Kollaa will hold. And when officers asked how a thin line of under-equipped Finns was surviving against one of the largest armies on earth, the soldiers just pointed toward the woods and said, "Because Simo is fighting." He didn't behave like a traditional sniper. He behaved like a hunter. He tracked Soviet patterns, who moved first, which officers gestured with their hands, which men carried radios. He memorized the timing of artillery volleys, the angle of afternoon sunlight, the direction snowflakes drifted when the wind shifted. Soviet snipers were sent to kill him. They failed, one after another. Some never even fired a single shot before Simo found them. He moved low and slow, often crawling inches at a time. Sometimes he lay buried in snow for so long that frost formed on his eyelashes. When Soviet snipers thought they had triangulated his position, he was already 10 meters to the left. He became unpredictable not because he moved often, but because he moved intelligently, rarely, quietly, decisively. By Christmas, he had amassed dozens of confirmed kills, then dozens more, then hundreds. But the numbers didn't capture the full truth. The truth was psychological. Entire Soviet platoons became terrified of the forest itself. They fired at shadows. They refused to advance during daylight. Soviet diaries recovered after the war revealed chilling entries. "We do not fear the Finns. We fear the ghost." Soviet officers ordered artillery barrages on empty snowbanks simply to calm their soldiers' nerves. Some units tied amulets to their rifles. Others muttered prayers before stepping into certain sections of forest. None of it worked. Early January brought some of the most brutal temperatures Finland had ever recorded. Men's hands froze to rifles. Artillery shells misfired. The cold became a second enemy, one that cared nothing for rank or strategy. But the man known as the White Death was undeterred. One regiment attempted a massive push after a prolonged artillery barrage. As they advanced across a frozen meadow, Simo waited behind a fallen spruce, watching them through iron sights that never fogged. When they reached the center of the clearing, he began firing, not rapidly, but rhythmically, like a metronome counting down the seconds of their advance. Officers fell mid-stride. Spotters dropped beside them. Machine gunners collapsed onto their weapons. The formation buckled. Men screamed and scattered. And still the shots continued, predictable in their inevitability, unstoppable in their effect. When the survivors retreated, the entire field was littered with bodies, dark against the snow. Finnish soldiers who inspected the aftermath didn't speak. They didn't know what to say. They were witnessing something beyond war, beyond skill, something terrifying and extraordinary. Throughout January and February, his kill count climbed. 50, 80, 120, 200. It climbed so quickly that officers began checking the reports twice, not because they didn't believe them, but because they barely made sense. How could one man do so much? But Simo never spoke of it. He never bragged. He never mentioned the numbers. When asked later how he felt about the lives he took, he simply said, "I was doing my duty." The Soviets didn't see him that way. In their eyes, he was not a man. He was a force. They deployed elite counter-sniper teams. They set fire to entire sections of forest. They used flamethrowers. They shelled ridges until the trees shattered like glass. Nothing worked. Simo didn't disappear because of camouflage. He disappeared because the winter itself bent around him. By late February, Soviet High Command authorized payment rewards for anyone who could kill the White Death. None were collected. And every morning, as the grey light crawled over the frozen horizon, Simo Häyhä settled into another snowdrift, breathing slow, heartbeat steady, waiting for the next Soviet soldier to make the mistake of stepping where he could be seen. By late February, the Soviets were no longer fighting a Finnish army. They were fighting exhaustion, the cold, and the growing superstition that some force in the tree line had chosen them for death. Every man in those forests had heard stories of Simo Häyhä by then. It wasn't just rumour anymore. Bodies were the proof. The way the shots came without warning. The way they came from nowhere. The way the first man to lift his head always seemed to be the one who fell. Soviet officers began ordering their troops to crawl everywhere, even when it slowed their entire advance to a crawl. But crawling didn't save them. Low profiles only made them easier targets. Simo's iron sights found them just the same. The strange thing about Simo was not just his accuracy, it was the consistency of his calm. In the rare moments he spoke to other Finns on the line, he never bragged, never exaggerated, never dramatized the danger. When someone asked him how many Soviets he believed he had shot in a day, he shrugged softly and said, "A few." If someone said they heard the Soviets had placed a price on his head, he only nodded and said, "Then they will keep missing." His composure spread through the regiment like warmth in the cold. Men fought harder when they knew Simo was nearby, not because he was a symbol, but because he was dependable in a landscape where everything else felt unpredictable. The battles around Kollaa grew more violent as February progressed. Soviet commanders were under immense pressure from Moscow to break the Finnish line, no matter the losses. They rotated fresh regiments into the sector, hoping that new troops might advance without the psychological weight of what the earlier units had seen. But these troops learned just as quickly. The first shot that pierced the cold air erased any illusion that the White Death was merely a rumour. Finnish soldiers described Simo's daily rhythm as something almost ritualistic. He woke before dawn, when the cold was sharpest and silence was deepest. He ate little, perhaps a piece of bread or a sugar cube, and moved out before sunrise. He preferred positions he knew intimately, spots where he could sense Soviet movement by listening to the faintest tremor of branches or the subtle shift of wind. Sometimes he was gone for 10 hours, sometimes for 12. When he returned, his white clothing stiff with frost, he rarely spoke about what he had done. His silence wasn't secrecy. It was simply his nature. Soviet attempts to counter him grew desperate. One day, they deployed 2 heavy machine gun teams on opposite sides of a clearing, hoping to trap him between interlocking fire. But Simo never walked into traps. He studied the landscape as if listening to it speak. He knew where sound travelled strangely, where snow muffled footsteps, where the land offered just enough concealment. He circled behind them through a frozen marsh, moving so slowly the crusted snow barely cracked. Before the Soviet gunners ever saw him, they were slumped over their weapons. Another time, the Soviets attempted to lure him by sending a small squad forward, pretending to be lost, waving white cloth as if surrendering. But their act was sloppy. Their steps were too deliberate, their spacing too exact. They were soldiers pretending not to be soldiers. Simo didn't fire. He simply waited, watching from adrift on higher ground. Minutes later, when they broke their formation and rushed forward expecting to flush out his position, they ran into Finnish rifle fire from the side. Simo hadn't warned anyone verbally, but the Finns had learned to read his absence. If he didn't take the first shot, something was wrong. By early March, Soviet units near Kollaa had begun moving only under heavy fog or during heavy snow. They hoped the swirling white might hide them. But fog didn't hide movement, it amplified it. Snow didn't dampen sound, it carried it. And Simo had spent his life moving through weather like this. He used fog the way a painter uses shadow, not to obscure things, but to reveal them. Shapes moved differently in fog. Colour shifted, silhouettes stood out. Soviet soldiers who believed they were invisible became easy targets. Finnish officers monitoring the line began to realize how much their defenses relied on Simo's presence. When he operated in a sector, Soviet casualties rose dramatically. When he moved elsewhere, that sector stabilized. His commanders debated moving him to the most threatened points, but doing so risked exposing him to new dangers. Still, he volunteered whenever the line trembled. Not out of bravado, but because he believed every inch of ground was worth protecting if Finns were standing on it. One of the most astonishing days came during a prolonged Soviet assault in early March. Artillery thundered for hours, shaking snow from trees like powdered glass. Entire sections of forest collapsed under shelling. The Soviets advanced in numbers so overwhelming that even seasoned Finnish veterans felt the freeze of fear crawl through their stomachs. But Simo didn't retreat. He crawled to a higher ridge, using shattered tree trunks as concealment. He waited until Soviet machine gunners began setting up their tripods. Then he started firing. He aimed not at the mass of soldiers, but at the linchpins, the radio operators, the squad leaders, the gunners. Men who controlled the flow of the attack. Each time one fell, the Soviet formation stuttered. A second shot, another collapse. A third, another pocket of confusion. Finnish officers watching through binoculars said it looked as though an invisible hand was plucking critical pieces out of the Soviet machine, dismantling it before it could fully awaken. When the Soviets finally retreated, leaving dozens of bodies frozen in contorted shapes, the Finnish line held once more. And the men whispered again, "Kollaa kestää." The line holds. But the Soviets were now more furious than frightened. Stalin demanded breakthroughs. His generals demanded results. And someone high in the Soviet chain of command finally gave an order. Eliminate the sniper at Kollaa at any cost. They brought in elite marksmen. They brought in reconnaissance teams. They brought in explosives specifically designed to collapse potential sniper hides. They studied every ridge, every line of sight, every angle from which Simo might be firing. They charted topography, tracked Finnish patterns, measured distances, and built firing solutions for their best snipers. But they misunderstood something fundamental. Simo did not fire from conventional sniper positions. He avoided height unless absolutely necessary. He avoided trees entirely. Trees moved in the wind, revealing position. He avoided anything the Soviets might consider tactical. Instead, he chose the unexpected. He chose the coldest, flattest, least appealing patches of snow, where no soldier wanted to lie for hours. He made himself part of the landscape because he had spent his entire life inside it. One Soviet sniper came closer than any before him. He had studied Finnish tactics extensively, understood how light refracted off ice, and knew how to interpret faint clues in snow that might reveal a firing position. He spent an entire day stalking the forest near Kollaa, moving slowly, reading the ground. He noticed a slight depression in a drift on a ridge, a spot that might hide a prone shooter. He took aim. He steadied his breath. But before he could fire, a shot punched cleanly through the ice-encrusted scarf around his neck. Simo had never been in the depression at all. He had anticipated that exact line of thought and positioned himself where no sniper with traditional training would ever look. As the days dragged on, even Finns who had grown used to Simo's supernatural-seeming abilities found themselves astonished. They watched him return from missions with frost clinging to his eyelashes, his face half buried in snow, his expression untroubled. He would take a sip of warm broth, check his rifle with gentle hands, and prepare to go back out the next morning. When Soviet soldiers finally captured a Finnish position and found one of his old firing spots, they were bewildered by its simplicity. No sandbags, no boards, no dugout. Just a shallow depression sculpted by hand, a small wall of snow shaped to hide his muzzle blast, and a few melted indentations where his body had warmed the ground beneath him. It wasn't a sniper's nest, it was a hunter's blind, and it had been enough to destroy entire Soviet companies. By early March, Soviet commanders were losing patience. The winter war had dragged on far longer than expected. Every day was an embarrassment to Stalin's regime. So they prepared one final offensive, one meant to break the line at Kollaa once and for all. If they could crush this sector, they believed Finnish defences elsewhere would collapse in a domino effect. On March 6th, the Soviets launched an assault unlike anything the Finns had yet seen. Artillery hammered the forest for hours, turning drifts of snow into torn craters. The roar shook branches until they snapped and fell like dead limbs. Soviet infantry surged forward under the cover of smoke. The temperature that day hovered near -20 degrees Celsius, but men still sweated beneath their coats from fear. And Simo was already crawling toward the front. He moved with purpose, weaving between shattered pines, scanning for Soviet snipers. The air was thick with smoke and drifting snow, a combination that turned visibility into a blur of grey. But Simo didn't need clarity. He needed movement. He saw it at the edge of a tree line, a faint shift of dark cloth, the tiny glint of a scope. He raised his rifle. The Soviet sniper fired first. The bullet hit Simo in the lower jaw with explosive force, ripping through flesh and bone, tearing open his cheek, shattering teeth, and throwing him backward into the snow. His rifle flew from his hands. Blood poured onto the ice in a thick, steaming ribbon that froze almost instantly. Even then, bleeding, half-conscious, face torn apart, Simo tried to stand. He couldn't. Finnish comrades rushed to him, horrified at the sight. One of them later said it looked like half his face was missing. They dragged him into cover as shells thundered around them, wrapping his destroyed jaw with cloth, praying he would survive long enough to reach a medic. He should have died there. But Simo Häyhä had endured worse winters than most men could survive. He stayed conscious long enough to be pulled onto a sled and hauled through snow toward a field station lit by faint lantern glow. Medics tore frozen fabric from his face, shocked he was still breathing. They worked quickly, removing metal fragments and clearing ice and blood from the wound. And somehow, against all odds, his pulse remained steady. As Finnish surgeons fought to keep him alive, the front line at Kollaa continued to hold. Not because Simo was still there, but because the men he had protected for months now carried his spirit in them. When word spread that Simo had been gravely wounded but not killed, something hardened in the Finnish ranks. They refused to let the line fall on the same day the White Death was carried from the battlefield. And so, on the frozen ground of eastern Finland, the battle raged as the man who had become a myth drifted into unconsciousness, unaware that the war he had helped shape was entering its final, desperate days. When the surgeons finally pulled the last fragment of metal from what remained of Simo's lower face, they stepped back and wondered how he had survived the journey at all. His jaw was pulverized, teeth shattered, cheekbone torn open, and swelling already threatening to suffocate him. They stabilized him, stitched what they could, packed the wound with gauze, and prayed the swelling wouldn't close his airway before morning. Nurses hovered near his cot, checking his pulse every few minutes. Outside, the wind howled like a creature battering the wooden walls of the makeshift field hospital. Shells rumbled in the distance. The war churned on without him. For the first time since the Soviet invasion began, the forests of Kollaa were silent without Simo's rifle. Finnish soldiers on the line whispered about him that night. Some assumed he was dead. Others said no man as stubborn as Simo could be killed so easily. But every soldier felt the absence. For months, they'd lived with the comfort of knowing somewhere in the snow, unseen, Simo was watching over them. Now, the tree line felt emptier, colder, more exposed. Yet even without him, the line did not break. Men who had watched him work for months found themselves fighting with a fierceness they hadn't known they possessed. If the White Death had bled for those ridges, they would not surrender them lightly. When dawn came, Simo was still alive. Barely. His breathing rattled in his throat, each inhale a struggle. His face was grotesquely swollen, so large and misshapen that even close comrades wouldn't have recognized him. The doctors moved him again, this time by sled, pulling him deeper into Finnish territory, toward a larger medical station, where he might survive the next 24 hours. The cold air burned the exposed tissues of his wound, but it also slowed the bleeding. In a strange way, the winter that had defined his life was now preserving it. The day after he was evacuated, March 7th, Soviet representatives requested a ceasefire. Their losses were catastrophic. Finland's defences had held far longer than anyone expected. And though the Soviets continued fighting for a few more days, negotiations were already in motion. The Winter War, the brutal 105-day conflict that had dragged both nations into hell, was in its final stretch. On March 13th, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The war was over. But Simo knew nothing about it. For nearly a week he drifted in and out of consciousness, fever rising, infection threatening to undo everything the surgeons had fought for. His head was so swollen that one doctor remarked it looked like a giant loaf of bread. Only on the day the war officially ended did Simo begin to wake. No one bothered telling him the news immediately. He was too weak to understand anything beyond the pain radiating through his skull. He blinked through blurred vision, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. But he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. When he finally regained enough clarity to understand where he was and what had happened, he reached toward his face and felt only bandages. One of the medics quietly explained that a Soviet EXP bullet had hit him, designed to explode or fragment on impact. Simo nodded once, slowly, accepting the information without visible reaction. Then, using swollen fingers, he traced the air as if reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. The medic placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said, "It's over. The war has ended." Simo's eyes widened slightly. He had fought so long, so fiercely, that the idea of silence felt foreign. He gestured for a pencil and paper, though his hands trembled too violently to write at first. Eventually, he scratched a faint question. "Did we hold the line?" The medic smiled. "We held," he said. "Kollaa held." Simo closed his eyes. That was enough. Recovery was slow. His jaw required massive reconstruction. Eating became an ordeal. Talking was nearly impossible. Surgeons removed bone fragments for weeks. His face remained swollen for months, and for a time he feared he might never look human again. But one advantage Simo had always possessed, quiet resilience, now served him more than ever. He approached recovery the way he approached hunting, with patience. He did not complain. He did not despair. He accepted each day as its own challenge. When he was finally well enough to stand for short periods, Finnish officers visited him. They explained that his confirmed tally, those kills verified by multiple eyewitnesses, stood at 259. Unconfirmed estimates placed him far higher, into the 300s or even 500s. Simo could only blink slowly as the officers listed the numbers. He raised his hand slightly, as if wanting to correct them, then shook his head. Numbers were irrelevant to him. His goal had been simple: protect Finland. The officers assured him that he had done that, and more. Outside of the hospital, Finland mourned deeply. The peace treaty required the nation to cede 11% of its territory, including Karelia, forcing 400,000 Finns to abandon their homes. Yet despite the painful concessions, the world acknowledged Finland as a nation that had resisted impossible odds with ferocity and dignity. And among the stories pouring out of that war, none spread faster than the legend of the White Death. By spring of 1940, newspapers across Europe and America were writing about the quiet farmer who had turned the frozen forests into a graveyard for invading armies. Some stories exaggerated his abilities, attributing supernatural senses to him. Others reported mythical numbers, claiming he had killed 1,000 men. Some even suggested he was a monster created in a secret Finnish training program. Reporters requested interviews, photographs, statements, but Simo wanted nothing to do with fame. He remained in the hospital, silent, focused only on healing. As weeks turned into months, Simo's face slowly began to regain shape. Surgeons rebuilt his jaw using grafts. His cheekbone was repaired. His nose had been destroyed and required extensive reconstruction. For a time, he wore a mask over the lower half of his face to protect the fragile tissues as they healed. But despite everything, his eyes retained the same calm steadiness he'd always possessed. Nurses often commented that he looked less like a wounded soldier and more like a man quietly waiting for winter to return. By late 1940, he was strong enough to walk the hospital grounds. He favoured solitude, quiet paths, shaded corners, places where the wind sounded like it did in Rautjärvi. Visitors came often. Some were soldiers who had fought beside him, awkwardly expressing gratitude. They owed their lives to the man who had kept their sectors from collapsing, and many struggled to find the words to convey that. Simo listened politely, nodding, sometimes placing a hand on their shoulder. He never claimed credit, never reinforced their praise. He simply thanked them for coming and wished them well. One visitor, a high-ranking officer, presented him with a specially engraved rifle as a token of national gratitude. Simo accepted it with a faint, crooked smile, the best smile he could manage with his healing face, and ran his hand along the polished wood. It wasn't a weapon to him. It was a symbol of the life he had lived before the war, and perhaps of the life he hoped to return to. As the months passed, the Finnish High Command considered various roles for him. They debated whether he might serve as an instructor, training the next generation of marksmen. Others suggested diplomatic appearances or morale-boosting tours. But Simo gently refused all such offers. He wanted no spotlight, no podium, no stage. He wanted only to return to the land, to the forests that had shaped him. The war had taken much from him, his anonymity, his peace, part of his face, but it had not taken his love of the outdoors. In late 1941, as Europe plunged deeper into conflict with the continuation war, Finland again found itself tied to German operations against the Soviet Union. Officers approached Simo cautiously. They didn't ask him to return to the front. They already knew his answer. But they hoped he might at least consider training snipers, passing on the instinctive knowledge that had made him so lethal. Simo listened, thoughtful, then shook his head. He communicated slowly, with effort, that what he did in the Winter War could not be taught easily. It came from a lifetime in the forest, from experiences no drill or manual could replicate. Trying to force those skills into other men would only disappoint them. He wished Finland well, but he would not re-enter the war in any capacity. Instead, he returned to Rautjärvi, settling into a quieter existence. His face continued healing, though it never returned to its original form. Scars framed his jaw. His smile remained crooked. Eating required deliberate effort. Speaking was difficult for years, but in the forests, none of that mattered. Deer did not judge the shape of his face. Snow did not care about scars. The wind did not notice missing teeth. He resumed hunting, fishing, farming, things that made him feel human again. For a while, he lived in near-total obscurity. Finns knew his name, but they also respected his desire for solitude. He did not attend ceremonies. He did not grant interviews. He avoided photographers whenever possible. Decades would pass before he agreed to speak publicly about his experiences, and even then he spoke sparingly. Yet the legend only grew. Soldiers who had fought alongside him told younger generations stories of the man who could make himself vanish in waist-deep snow. Foreign journalists visiting Finland asked about him constantly. Some doubted he was even real. Others believed he was exaggerated beyond recognition. But those who served with him knew the truth. Simo Häyhä was not a myth. He was simply a man who understood his land better than anyone who ever tried to fight on it. Years after the war, one of his former commanders visited him at his rural home. They sat together on a wooden bench, watching snow fall in thick flakes. The commander eventually asked, "Simo, how did you do it? How did you stay so calm?" Simo took several seconds before answering. Speaking with his reconstructed jaw was slow, each word deliberate. "I waited," he said. "I listened. The forest speaks if you let it." The commander smiled, understanding that no explanation could ever fully capture what Simo had done. As Finland rebuilt itself in the post-war decades, Simo lived quietly, taking pride in ordinary tasks. He worked as a dog breeder for a time. He participated in civilian shooting competitions occasionally, though he never showed interest in winning medals. When someone praised his wartime skill, he would shrug and say something like, "The rifle worked well," or "The snow was deep." He always shifted credit away from himself. But the truth was undeniable. Simo had been responsible for more confirmed kills in a shorter period than any sniper in recorded history. And yet he felt no need to dwell on it. He did his duty. That was enough. As the decades passed, he grew older, slower, gentler. The fearsome reputation he'd earned in the Winter War became almost humorous to him. Children who visited him had trouble believing this soft-spoken, half-smiling man with a reconstructed face had once terrified entire Soviet regiments. He would laugh softly, pat their shoulders, and tell them to respect nature and work hard. His voice remained quiet, but his words carried weight. And so the years rolled on, each winter reminding him of days long gone. He walked the forests until his legs no longer allowed it. He hunted sparingly, more for tradition than necessity. He spoke little, remembered much, and lived simply. But the legend, that could not fade. Not while so many who survived the Winter War still remembered the calm farmer who saved them again and again. Not while historians continued documenting the conflict. Not while Finland itself existed as a nation that had survived annihilation, in part because one man refused to let the snow belong to anyone but the Finns. And as Simo aged into his 70s, 80s and 90s, he became something unexpected. Not a ghost, not a weapon, not a myth, but a symbol of resilience, quiet strength, and unshakable duty. As the decades passed, the world around Simo Häyhä changed dramatically, but the man himself remained largely the same. Finland modernized, cities grew, new generations were born who knew the Winter War only through textbooks and stories told by grandparents. But those stories often included a name that seemed almost mythical, even as it belonged to a living man. Children heard of the White Death the way others heard of Beowulf or Odysseus. Tales of impossible survival, legendary marksmanship, and a quiet man who moved through snow like a spirit. To children, the idea that he still lived somewhere in Finland felt unreal. To the older generation who had watched the war unfold, the legend was accurate but incomplete. They knew the truth. He had never been a supernatural figure. He had simply been a man who refused to break when the world demanded it. By the 1950s, Simo lived mostly in rural peace, spending his days hunting, fishing, and tending to small tasks on the land. His face, though reconstructed, bore the unmistakable marks of the Soviet EXP round that had torn it apart. The scars were deep, the jawline uneven, the smile forever tilted. But he carried those features with quiet dignity. People sometimes stared when he visited town, curious or startled, unsure whether to ask what happened. He rarely explained. If pressed, he would simply say, "War happened," and nothing more. Simo found joy in working with animals. He raised hunting dogs and trained them with the same patience he had once used in the forest during wartime. Neighbours remembered the sight of him strolling through fields with a small pack of dogs trailing behind him, all moving with the calm and steady gait that mirrored their owner's demeanour. He treated the dogs not as tools, but as companions, teaching them discipline through gentle repetition rather than force. He had always preferred quiet competence to loud instruction. Occasionally, former soldiers sought him out. They wanted to thank him, to tell him he had saved their lives without ever knowing their names. Some brought families. Some brought grandchildren. They sat with him on his porch or in his small kitchen, sipping coffee as wood crackled in the stove. These men struggled to articulate the depth of their emotion, but Simo understood without needing them to say much. He never accepted their gratitude with pride, only with humility, as if unsure he deserved it. When someone said, "You were a hero," he would shake his head gently and reply, "We all fought. I only did what I could." But in truth, even many Finns felt he had done more than anyone had a right to expect. They spoke of him the way other nations spoke of saints or protectors. During harsh winters, older men would say, "This weather feels like something Simo would enjoy." During political debates about national defence, someone would inevitably mutter, "If only we had a few more men like him." It wasn't hero worship. It was gratitude shaped into folklore. He had become a kind of guardian spirit embodied in a man who remained very much alive. Despite his fame, Simo did not live lavishly. He built no business empire, wrote no memoir, opened no museum. He chose simplicity, as if refusing to let war define the rest of his existence. This humility only added to the legend. Foreign journalists visiting Helsinki sometimes inquired about him, wanting to interview the most lethal sniper in recorded history. Finnish officials often answered cryptically, saying, "He prefers peace." Some journalists assumed he was reclusive or hostile to attention, but the truth was gentler. He simply didn't see himself as extraordinary. He didn't want attention, not because he feared it, but because he saw no purpose in it. In the 1960s and 1970s, as global interest in military sniping grew, foreign militaries began studying winter war tactics. American instructors teaching in sniper schools included sections about the White Death, how he used snow for concealment, how he avoided scopes in frigid conditions, how he controlled his breathing, how he read wind and terrain with instinctive precision. They taught his methods to new generations of marksmen without ever speaking to the man himself. Many assumed he must already have died. A few were shocked to learn he was alive, but living so quietly that contacting him seemed nearly impossible. By the 1980s, Finland was a very different country from the one he had defended as a young man. Streets were paved, telecommunications blossomed, and international connections deepened. Tourism increased. And occasionally, someone visiting from abroad would hear the name Simo Häyhä in conversation and ask, "Is that the real one? From the Winter War?" Locals would smile and nod. "He lives not far from here," they might say. "You won't find a man more polite." He remained private, but not unfriendly. When strangers approached him respectfully, he never turned them away. He would speak slowly, carefully, choosing words that required minimal movement of his reconstructed jaw. Sometimes he would offer them coffee. Sometimes he would answer a question or two about the war. But he never glorified it. When someone asked how he became such a skilled marksman, he responded with, "Practice." When someone asked how he felt about killing so many men, he said, "One bitter day after another." And when someone asked if he regretted anything, he answered, "I regret war." Age softened him even further. His shoulders rounded slightly, his steps slowed, but his eyes remained sharp, pale and steady, the same eyes that had scanned forests for movement decades earlier. Even in his 80s and 90s, he still hunted occasionally, though with the help of younger companions. They would walk behind him cautiously, half expecting the old man to outshoot them. And sometimes he did. Even at 90, he could hit targets with uncanny accuracy. His hands remained steady. His breathing remained controlled. His mind remained clear. The forest still welcomed him like an old friend. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that Simo slowly began opening up about his experiences, not because he wanted to, but because historians persistently asked, and he recognized their importance. Finland was losing many of its Winter War veterans to age, and historical memory risked fading with them. So Simo, always a man of duty, allowed a few interviews. He never spoke dramatically. He never embellished. His answers were short, factual, practical, just like the man himself. One interviewer asked, "How did you endure such harsh winters on the front?" Simo answered, "I had warm clothes and good friends." Another asked, "What were you thinking when you saw Soviet soldiers approaching your position?" He said, "I thought about doing my job." When asked if he felt fear, he replied, "Sometimes, but fear is only a feeling. You do the work anyway." In one now famous conversation, a younger Finnish soldier asked him, "How did you become the best sniper in the war?" Simo paused for several seconds, then said, "By practicing the craft, and by not wishing to be anything special." That final phrase became one of his most quoted lines. It captured everything about him: the modesty, the discipline, the refusal to see himself as a hero. By the early 2000s, Simo was one of the last surviving icons of the Winter War. Finland had changed beyond recognition since his youth, but the country still held deep respect for the men who had defended its independence. Simo was honoured at veterans' gatherings, though he rarely stayed long. Crowds made him uncomfortable. Loud praise embarrassed him. He preferred small conversations, brief handshakes, and quiet exits through side doors. But every time he appeared, people sensed the weight of history in the room. Not because he looked imposing, he didn't, but because his presence carried a kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. One winter, late in his life, a young journalist visited him to record what would become one of his final interviews. They sat near a window overlooking snow-covered trees. The journalist hesitated before asking one of the hardest questions. How did it feel to know so many men feared you, that they called you the White Death? Simo took a long breath, his chest rising slowly beneath his wool sweater. Then he said, "It was war. They were soldiers doing their duty, same as me. Fear belongs to war, not to a man." Another question followed. "Do you think about the men you killed?" Simo stared outside for a moment, watching flakes drift lazily past the glass. "Sometimes," he said, "but I think more about the men we lost. Those memories stay longer." The journalist later wrote that nothing about Simo suggested pride or regret, only acceptance. A quiet acknowledgement that life had taken him down a path he never sought, and he had walked it with the calmest steps he could manage. As he moved into his late 90s, Simo lived in a veterans' nursing home in Hämeenä. Staff members described him as polite, gentle, and often amused by the world around him. He enjoyed watching ice hockey games. He loved the smell of pine forests. He preferred sitting near windows where he could see birds flit between branches. Despite his age, he still spoke of hunting with fondness, though he had stopped doing it physically. He sometimes held imaginary rifles, adjusting his posture out of habit, demonstrating to nurses how he once steadied his breath before a shot. These small gestures made them smile. This elderly man with a soft voice had once shaped the fate of a nation. Visitors still came occasionally, historians, soldiers, curious Finns who wanted to shake his hand before time carried him away. He treated them all kindly. When someone thanked him for his service, he would nod and reply, "Finland is worth defending." He said it simply, not as a slogan or patriotic boast, but as a quiet truth. In early 2002, his health began to decline. He was nearly 97 years old. His body, worn by war and age, began to slow. Nurses noticed he was sleeping more, eating less, speaking softer. But even then, he remained calm. One nurse later recalled that he looked as if he were waiting for winter to arrive one last time. On April 1st, 2002, Simo Häyhä passed away peacefully in the Hämeenä facility, surrounded by staff who had grown to love the gentle man behind the legend. News of his death spread quickly across Finland. Newspapers dedicated entire pages to his life. Television programs broadcast tributes. Schools discussed him in classrooms. Flags were lowered. Even foreign militaries acknowledged the passing of a figure who had shaped the modern concept of sniper warfare. What surprised many younger Finns was learning how soft-spoken he had been. People expected a hardened warrior, but instead they saw photographs of an elderly man smiling shyly, wearing a wool cap, cradling hunting dogs. They read quotes that revealed not bravado, but humility. They learned he never bragged about his record, never sought recognition, never claimed to be extraordinary. For many, this humility made him even more legendary. After his death, historians compiled testimonies from soldiers who had served beside him. They described moments that had gone unnoticed during the war, times when Simo volunteered for the most dangerous missions without hesitation, times when he shared rations with starving comrades, times when he risked exposure just to drag wounded Finns back to safety. One soldier recalled seeing him crawling through snow under machine gun fire to retrieve a friend. When the soldier tried to follow, Simo stopped him. "2 men die if you come," he whispered. "Only 1 if I go." He went alone. He returned with the wounded man on his back. Another veteran remembered how Simo would spend long hours repairing other men's rifles, making small adjustments that improved accuracy. He could make a bad rifle good, the man said. He understood weapons like he understood the forest. And on the Soviet side, declassified documents revealed the extent of their fear. Reports described soldiers refusing orders if they involved advancing into areas believed to be hunted by the White Death. One report listed 3 entire companies lost in a single week, with officers writing in the margins, "Unseen marksman, impossible to locate, demoralizing effect extreme." Another report admitted that one of the reasons the Soviets shifted tactics in January 1940 was because a single Finnish sniper was significantly hindering operations. As historians pieced together these accounts, they realized Simo's legend had not been exaggerated. If anything, it had been understated. His confirmed tally remains the highest of any sniper in a major war. He accomplished this in less than 100 days, using iron sights in unimaginable cold against overwhelming numbers. And yet, when asked for the secret to his success, he gave the smallest of answers: practice. In the years following his death, Finland honoured him with exhibitions, documentaries, and essays. His hometown erected markers celebrating his life. Military academies analysed his tactics. Hunters spoke of him with respect. His name became synonymous with precision, patience, and quiet strength. And through it all, the man himself remained frozen in memory, as he had been in life. Humble, resolute, silent when unnecessary, and devastatingly effective when duty required action. The final image many Finns hold of him is simple: an old man in a wool coat, standing in a snowy field, holding a rifle not as a weapon, but as an extension of himself. His eyes scanning the horizon not for enemies, but for the beauty of a world he had fought fiercely to protect. A world that had changed dramatically since his youth, yet still carried echoes of the forests where he once lay so silently that even death itself seemed to hesitate before approaching him. Simo Häyhä's story is not just the tale of a sniper. It is the story of a man shaped by land, defined by duty, and remembered for doing what he believed needed doing. Nothing more, nothing less. He never sought glory. He never sought recognition. He sought only to serve. And because of that, his legend endures. Even today, when snow falls quietly across the Finnish countryside and forests settle into the deep winter silence he knew so well, many imagine him still there, somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen, steady, waiting, not hunting, not fighting, just watching the land he loved, a land that, thanks in part to him, remains free.